we're going to get started. We're talking about weathering storms, how Robinhood uses Drupal to fight poverty. This is a case study, and we're going to be talking about some of the challenges that we encountered and how we weathered these storms. Just first off, a little bit of introductions. A little louder? Sure. Okay. Introductions. My name is Molly Burns. I'm a project manager at Phase 2, and I guess we can go around.
Sure. I'm Brian McMurray. I'm a software architect. I've been working with the Robinhood Foundation for, I guess it's been almost 2 years. The last 2 years we've been partnering with them, and so primary front-end developer on this site.
Cool. I'm John Robert Wilson, or J.R. Wilson, and I'm also an architect over at Phase 2. And I was more or less the same spiel as Brian, but I was the back-end guy.
Yep, and my name is Stephen Merrill. I'm a director of engineering at Phase 2 Technology, and I did a lot with the hosting setup and sort of ensuring that Robinhood could perform to the level that they needed to.
Sure, and there's also Heather Johnson is up there. She's the senior applications manager at Robinhood, who we worked very closely with on this project. And we actually presented at DrupalCon about this, and she was with us, but she's not here today. But she's obviously a big part of the project team. All right, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about Robinhood and what Robinhood is and how they work. Robinhood is a really interesting organization in that their mission is to fight poverty in New York City, and they take a very interesting metrics-based approach for how they decide who their grantees are going to be. So it's all about finding the most effective organization. So you can kind of see this pyramid here. They find the 200 most effective, so they know that the money that they are raising is making the most difference. And they have a 100% model, which essentially means that the overhead of their organization is paid for by their board, so that 100% of all donations that come in are allocated directly to programs. So it's a really great model, and they do a lot of amazing work. So just a couple more details. They're the largest poverty fighter in New York. They are also the largest private funder of emergency food in New York, so they fund a lot of soup kitchens and a lot of food programs, distribution programs as well. They're also the largest private funder of job training programs in New York City, so they take a very sort of capacity building approach to poverty fighting, where they're actually working with grantees that are doing a lot of job placement and job training. And then another component is that they fund education programs. They do a lot of work with charter schools, some experimental education programs, and that's a big part of how they're fighting poverty, by essentially educating the next generation. And they're also the largest private funder of homeless shelters in New York City. So fighting poverty, having a home, work well together, obviously. All right, so that's just a little bit of background on the organization, and now we'll get into some of the challenges for the Robinhood.org project. So Robinhood started off with a 10-year-old legacy CMS that was based on a .NET back end, and when they wanted to redo their site, they had a couple of challenges that were very high in the mind of the organization. And the number one thing was sort of the ability for editors to be able to control the site. So that was definitely one big one. And then they needed to be able to move quickly, and also have a site that performs effectively if there's a spike. So we're going to be talking about all of those challenges. It's just a little bit of a sneak peek. Just a little bit about Phase 2. We're a 75 plus. We're definitely growing interactive firm. We use open source, do a lot of work with strategy, design, development, so sort of kind of all things digital, and with a major focus on Drupal, open source, and whatever's the right tool for the job. We're definitely leaders in the Drupal community, and our headquarters are in Alexandria, Virginia, near DC, and we also have an office in New York and most of us, with the exception of Brian, are based in New York, where Robinhood is, and so we were able to kind of do work with them on site. So let's move into the first challenge. So the process for when we were developing the site initially was going through a discovery process. So was a period of time where we were kind of working with the Robinhood team and understanding all their use cases, all their goals for the site. This is actually before my time, so you guys were involved in this process. But one of the big goals that came out of this discovery process was the way in which they wanted to make sure that their content and their code were separated, and that the editors had control over how the site looked, but they really wanted to make sure there was a distinction between, they weren't just allowed to just go in and willy-nilly edit HTML. So that was definitely a combination of editorial control, but also sort of a clean approach of separating these two things. So that was definitely one of the biggest challenges. And just a little more background about the previous site, where they were kind of coming from, and what was informing the development of the new site was that it was a highly limited environment. So you kind of see these three circles of the Venn diagram between creating new content, uploading images, and being able to modify the look and feel of the site. And they were pretty much just in that tiny little center area. And they had needs to kind of go beyond that and to really not be tripped up by having to call up a developer to change something every day. But they really wanted that flexibility to continue to change their site as needs came up for their work and their outreach. That was definitely a big part of it, and they were also on a single web server, so there was not opportunity for scaling, and they definitely wanted to make sure that their site could grow and adapt because of some of their high-profile events. They had a concert where Lady Gaga would say, "Oh, I'm going to be in Central Park," and she would tweet it to all of her followers.
And this was when Lady Gaga more or less ran Twitter. Too. So,
all right. So I'm gonna kind of pass it over to Brian next to kind of talk through.
So you may have seen this photo before. This image. It's a few years old. It was created by Angie Byron. This is sort of how we as Drupal developers, if you've been working with Drupal for a while, might look at a page and think about it. Like, you can look and see, like, oh, we'll call that a view, and these other things, those are blocks, and this over here, that's a node, and there's lots of jargon here, and it's very Drupal specific, and that's not really how regular people look at web pages. More often they look at something like this. Everything is content, and that's really like the conversation that we were having with Robinhood's editors as we were sitting down to talk to them about building a website. They wanted to not be constrained by really anything in their site, and they saw all of these things as content, and content was something that they wanted to be able to control, and that meant more than just changing the text in something fairly often. As the design started to come through from their design agency that they had partnered with for a very long time, the site started to take on these sort of long page looks with these large colorful sections, and each one is very different. This would be pretty hard if you're trying to come up with like one content type in Drupal to sort of handle something like this. This is not an easy thing. You've got images that go all the way across. You've got large background images, things in different colors, different sizes. They were actually intending things like this pie graph to be interactive, so they wanted embedded interactive content, in the same flow as their regular text. Those are not easy problems to tackle, and they really didn't want to be constrained by just this. They wanted to be, we call it unleash the editors. They truly wanted to be unleashed and to be able to run with their imagination, come up with something that was highly different, and be able to control it themselves. So you can probably imagine that as we're sitting down with them, we're like seeing stars a little bit as they're saying we want to change everything. Us trying to come up with ideas for how we might help them do that in a way that's not requiring them to become Drupal masters or programmers. So what we started coming up with is this concept of panes. So each of those things started being broken into what we call a pane, and the terminology is a namespace conflict with the panels module. This isn't using the panels module. At the time when we started working with Robinhood, panels was still in its infancy in Drupal 7 and wasn't quite ready for the sorts of editor experiences that we wanted. I think now there's a pretty good case to be made around Panelizer, Panoply, those sorts of things for really interesting editor experience. But at the time, it just wasn't going to cut it for what they needed to be able to do and where their skill levels at being familiar with HTML were. So we had these concepts of panes, and then you would create panes, individual panes that could be reused across different pages that were assembled into what we would call a pane stack. Again, sort of silly names, but it took and it worked. And what ended up being sort of the magic behind this, and we'll talk a little more about this in a bit, is a module called Beans, which stands for Block Entities Aren't Nodes, which is a really silly name. But basically what it means is you can create sort of reusable widgets that could then be embedded into the regular content. So a lot of their content ended up being WYSIWYG controllable. So what you see is what you get. You're probably familiar with the term. They could then embed these widget blocks, these beans, into their content to add extra interactivity and things. And then also another module that we ended up creating with them is called the Template API. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's what gives them the ability to create fairly flexible layouts with using the WYSIWYG, and then also be able to create highly interactive content that could then be used as part of this pane stack bean system. So this allowed us to create interactive data displays where they could easily go in and change the content of that, but what you would get on the visitor experience was a mobile-friendly data visualization without using Flash. And so I'm going to let JR talk a little bit more about beans.
Cool. So we were talking about the whole idea of making content really easy to manage for the editors that are running a site. And so let's take a step back for a second and think about how nodes and blocks come out of the box with Drupal 7. So out of the box, when you install Drupal 7 site, there's a disconnect between the way that you manage nodes and the way that you manage blocks. Brian showed those two pictures that WebChick drew a few years ago, and that normal people, and I would say maybe even our site editors, are closer to normal people than Drupal people in that everything they see on the page is just content. To them, the delineation between blocks and nodes doesn't really make much sense. And that's something we don't really want to necessarily force them to adhere to. So what a lot of people do when they install Drupal to manage the layout of the blocks or where certain blocks show up on their site, they install something called context module. But that's not necessarily a tool that you would want to give your end user. So Bean kind of bridges this gap, this disconnect between this idea that blocks and nodes are different. So Drupal 7 has this idea of entities, and that a lot of things in Drupal are sort of these base container objects with common functionality that sort of do have specializations that they do. So a node is an entity, a user is an entity, and with Beans, block entities aren't nodes, they're entities, they're block entities. There's the link to the project right there if you want to download it and install it. So you can go to the next slide. So one of the nice things that Bean adds to your site is adds an editorial UI that's very similar to the node UI to your site. So now we've gone from a completely different workflow from configuring the blocks in your site to a very, very familiar workflow that content creators are familiar with, now that they can think of nodes and blocks as content because that's how they naturally consider them both. So it comes with a regular filter and stuff like that, and all standard stuff that comes with the content list when you view nodes. So one of the last pieces, though, is if we're not going to use context and we're not going to use the default block placement that comes with Drupal 7, how are we going to give our editors the ability to place these blocks? And we used a module called embeddables. And embeddables is an awesome module that allows you to embed entities in the direct bodies of your WYSIWYGs. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a block. It can be a node. It can be a view of a user. But in this specific context, or in this specific case, rather, we used it to give the editors the ability to embed beans directly into their content. So at the beginning, the workflow for editing nodes and blocks is different, but using beans and embeddables with a nice styled WYSIWYG, you can consolidate the process into one singular content workflow to where it actually makes sense to the content editors that are authoring this content at the end of the day. So Brian mentioned really quickly this module called template API, or template field rather. Template API is a submodule of template field. Other way around. Sorry, yeah, that's right, correct. Template field is a submodule of template API. I'm sorry. And template field, or template API rather, is a suite of modules that consist of a rendering library and a template API, and it basically uses what's called CTools exportables to give developers the ability to give authors a bunch of templates to choose from on a given node. So we talked about panes and pane stacks with all those pictures that Brian talked about earlier. A pane is a content type that has a title and a template field. And when an author is going in and trying to choose what the layout is of their content, they're given a nice set of options from what they can choose from. So they're not really shoehorned into like, oh, this is the 50-50 content type, and this is the 70-30 content type. And if I want the page to be laid out with this many columns, I have to have a different type of node type. In this regard, we're actually going a step further. We're giving them all sorts of options for layout of the content, but we're also giving them options to create interactive graphics that they have complete control over. So Brian mentioned all those graphics earlier, in that they can select a template where they can put in just a bunch of form data, and that data will be translated into a nice, renderable, mobile-friendly Raphael.js graphic that an end user can click on and see all sorts of cool metrics on how much money was allocated to a specific program or so on.
I'll just jump in real quick and say, if you're interested in learning more about template field, template API, at DrupalCon Portland, I was on a panel called Different Ways to Control Your Layout. I talk a little bit more in depth about how template API is, what it is, and how it works. So check that out. The talk is available online, and I can give you a link afterward if you need help finding it.
Cool. Good info to know. So here's a quick example, a screenshot of what a specific template would look like. One of the simplest templates we had was the 50-50 template, consisting of a top area, a bottom area, middle left, and middle right. And you can see here that template consists of a vertical tabbed field set. So each tab is its own WYSIWYG area where you can type in the content you want. We have some predefined styles that the WYSIWYG sort of bows to that Brian will talk about here in a second, and that has brand-specific styles immediately load in. So the user doesn't necessarily have to go hunt and search for branded styles that are in sync with the brand, the color scheme and the brand that the organization wants to convey as a whole. So it's a very nice, very familiar editing experience. They're literally laying out the content how they wanted to see it and in the different sections of the template. So in another example that we don't have necessarily a screenshot right here, let's say they were creating interactive graphic. And some interactive graphics just take a bunch of text fields. So let's say they selected a template field. It would do an asynchronous callback using AJAX and dynamically load in the newest template once they select it from the template chooser.
So, when I mentioned WYSIWYG a couple minutes ago, a few of you, I saw your eyes kind of bug out of your faces. You're like, what is this guy talking about? This is the dumbest idea ever. Why would you just give them open WYSIWYG? Like, I would agree with you. Like two-year-old, like in the past, me would have agreed with you. Typically, what you get with WYSIWYG is a whole bunch of junk. and we really didn't want that. So we worked really hard to change that in this case. WYSIWYG, modern WYSIWYG has gotten a lot better in recent years. You have a lot more options to plug in and control the actual experience of using the WYSIWYG editor. And so, again, this is an example of a piece of content on their site that they put together using WYSIWYG. This is not like really terrible looking markup or anything. It's actually quite beautiful. It's sticking to their brand messaging. It's allowing them to choose colors and fonts and do so in a way that keeps them on their brand message. And again, this is the editor experience for how you might create something like that. Using the APIs available to the WYSIWYG editors, we were able to go in and modify the tools that were available to only provide the defaults to their brand colors, for instance, for the color drop-down. There's also a styles API for WYSIWYG that allows you to go in and define site-specific custom styles. So this allowed them to select their text, then pick a style that would automatically align it to a brand guideline. So they could easily switch to that sort of alternate Gothic font, or switch to a particular blue header style, all these sorts of things. It even allowed them to select images and add, the sort of video thumbnail overlay image onto that style, onto those images, because it was a link to a video player. These sorts of customizations to the WYSIWYG actually made it a very pleasant experience for them. They're allowed to do a whole lot of things that we couldn't have ever imagined or planned for at the beginning of the project. And they really surprise me all the time with the way that they get really creative with their content. Some of the other niceties that we did is, obviously they're allowed to pick different background colors for these panes that they're creating. We linked up the background color choice to the WYSIWYG editor so that it would do like it does here, change the background color so that they can actually pick their fonts and see what they're going to look like on that color as they're editing their content, as opposed to having to wait or save their content a whole bunch of times to do a preview. So those are the sorts of things that you can do to sort of upgrade your WYSIWYG experience that really gives content editors a whole lot of power to do some cool stuff. This is CK Editor and is using the WYSIWYG module from Drupal, which is a WYSIWYG API that allows you to really, in a more abstract way, tie into a number of different WYSIWYG editors.
Was this a pretty heavy level of effort to customize it?
The question was, if you couldn't hear, what was the level of effort to customize it? We've been working with them for a long time to help them tweak it, but a lot of these things are really straightforward API integration that the WYSIWYG module exposes, so it's really not that hard. You can drop these things in pretty easily.
So I think it's kind of good to note here too that just recently we rebuilt the gift acceptance mechanism of our online donation acceptance mechanism Robinhood with Drupal Commerce, and I have a whole presentation on introduction to Drupal Commerce and its broad concepts and exactly how we implemented it with Robinhood.org. It's at that link at the bottom there, but we just wanted to kind of throw this in because this is one of the latest features that we rolled out with the site. We made custom donation products out of the product entities that come with Drupal Commerce, and we gave them a nice custom checkout process by implementing some really cool commerce hooks that were given to them. And given that they're a nonprofit, the level of transparency that they have to have is a lot more than any like a corporate client or something like that. So we had to give them some very robust reporting tools on the back end. And Drupal, the Form API right, with the Batch API and integration with the Commerce API made that possible. But if you want to learn a little bit more about that, this isn't a commerce-specific talk. Check out that link.
I'll just keep going. So that as I just mentioned, like the Robinhood editors are really constantly surprising me with their creativity in the site. And you probably know about a year ago, Hurricane Sandy hit the eastern coast and was particularly devastating in the tri-state area around New York City. And obviously Robinhood being a very big player in that in that area needed to respond very quickly. And within a few hours, they were creating new pages on their website that were really starting to catalog and highlight how they were mobilizing as an organization to really respond. And then fairly quickly therein, they started coming up with the plan to throw a very large benefit concert. You may have heard of it. It was called 12-12-12, the Concert for Sandy Relief. It wasn't organized It wasn't organized by Robinhood. It was organized for their benefit, but they needed to get the word out. So they came to us one day and said, "We've created this huge page. We've created this new page, and we want it to go up, but we need to take the Robinhood branding off of it because." The concert is going up for our benefit, but we can't have it sort of appear branded as coming from Robinhood. It just needs to be a page up on the internet. Can you take that away? And we were just kind of like, what do you mean take it away?
Yeah, Heather called me up and she's like, "We need to do this. This is like serious. We're getting the coalition of concert organizers together. Can you let us know if we can do this? And we need to move on it ASAP." So like Brian said, it was like, can we take away the top of the site and the bottom of the site? Well.
The quick answer is yes. And it actually turned out to be really simple within the framework that we had already built them. They created this page, the one here on the far left, that they created this whole thing inside of their system building paint stacks, and they just needed to pop off the sort of Robinhood branded header and footer of the page. So we went in and made a really quick change to their website. We added a single checkbox to the paint stack content type, and it was basically show the site's branding or turn it off, and then a little bit of code that tied into that. And within an hour or two, we had given them the ability to create mini sites with their platform hosted on their large Drupal infrastructure that could take the traffic, more or less right away. And suddenly they had their eyes were just like, oh wow, we can really start going crazy now. And then they did. Within a couple of weeks, they went through multiple design iterations. We didn't have to help them. They had the power to do all of this themselves, and that was really amazing. They were pivoting so quickly with these designs that if even with the sort of high touch relationship that we have with them, it would have been difficult to respond that quickly. And because they were able to just do it, and they could work through the midnight hour if they wanted to get all those things changed, and never needed to come to us for a tweak. And that was like a really big shining moment for me of like, wow, we've given them a platform that lets them do something cool. So then it continued to get to sort of spiral out of control. We've jumped through a couple of these slides, but as this concert was building up steam, they were preparing for it to be the largest online music event in history, and that's what it actually turned out to be. The traffic projections were through the roof. 450 million unique visitors in the span of a couple of hours. That's hard for a nonprofit website to take that sort of traffic. That's hard for any website to take that sort of traffic. And it turned out that there too, thanks to Steven's infrastructure thinking at the beginning, we were able to really scale this whole system up pretty quickly to be able to handle that sort of traffic without really breaking a sweat and without breaking the bank. So there's a little more that you can read all about this. There's a link here to a blog post that I wrote about how quickly these sorts of tools helped Robinhood respond to this crisis. And now I think we're going to let Steven talk about some of that infrastructure that really set us up for success for them to keep their costs low on a normal day, but when the unpredictable strikes and they need to handle 450 million unique visitors, it can be there to help them out.
Yeah, so kind of the third problem that Robinhood typically faced was that generally they didn't have a ton of traffic, right? Like on an average day, and we'll actually show you some of the Google Analytics numbers that they let us give out. So on a typical day, they don't have a lot of traffic. But as we mentioned before, there were sometimes like they're having, they sponsored a concert in Central Park with the Black Eyed Peas, or Lady Gaga tweets about them, or a couple times during the lead up to the concert for Sandy Relief, there were times when they got just an unbelievable amount of traffic very, very quickly. And so, that was one of the pain points of their old system, was really not being able to scale and handle those sometimes. And we wanted to be sure that the system that we had given to them would allow them to handle a bunch of traffic both on their main site, and then even, as Brian mentioned, some of the predictions for what the concert site would get were in the 9-figure range. And we didn't actually get 9 figures, we got 8 figures in terms of uniques in a given night, but still a good number of folks that coming to a single website. So the hosting challenges that we had to overcome while working with Robinhood took a couple of different forms. One of them was that we did launch in a phased approach, and I'll talk more about how we did this, but we're actually finding this happening with a number of our clients these days where, we'll go in, give them a new system, but there's either, tens of thousands of old pages of content, or in the case of Robinhood, when we first launched, they weren't ready to turn off their donation system right at the start. So we had to say, okay, most of the site is going to be new in this new Drupal environment, but the old site still has to be up and accepting donations. Or for some of our other clients, we find, we literally have 50,000 pages of content, and we want to launch our new redesigned stuff, but then keep the other things around. So they had this physical hardware for the legacy CMS that was going to have to stick around. As we said before, there were event-driven traffic spikes, and there were big ones like Sandy Relief, and there were even smaller ones just around kind of the announcement of the concert. And so we had to be able to scale to meet demand without really breaking the bank. We didn't want to have a ton of servers sitting around not used, but we wanted to make sure that we'd be able to stay up. Security, of course, is a big concern for a large organization like Robinhood, like a lot of web organizations. Robinhood also has a couple of different CRM systems internally. So Drupal is not yet the end-all, be-all for data storage at Robinhood. They have an internal CRM for all their donor data, and they have another CRM for their grantee data. So we had to make sure that although currently Drupal doesn't handle all of that, it had to be able to speak to both of those. It had to be able to export, once we finish the commerce piece, out to their donation CRM. And it had to be able to import from their grantee CRM to make sure that what was displayed on the website was up to date with what their internal staff was updating in that particular CRM system. As I mentioned, they did use a phased rollout. So for the first 9 months, a year, some of the pages you'd go to, you'd hit Drupal. Some of them you'd go and you'd hit their legacy.net site. We managed to pare down the number of pages, but certainly all the donation-related stuff would go to the .net site. But that was still all it was all hitting the same IP address. It was all going the same place. So the hosting environment had to know how to disambiguate and send things to the right place. And the donation portion continued to be on legacy.net. So we knew, of course, this was Drupal. We were going to host it on a LAMP stack environment. And so we decided that as we do on many of our projects, we were going to use Puppet for configuration management. So it would be very easy to say, put a dev server together that has all of our configurations on them, put a staging environment that has a couple different machines, and then for the production environment, have a set of Puppet configurations. And all this really means is that then, if we need to launch a new proxy server or we need to launch a new webhead, you just bring it up, say this is a web server, let it contact the Puppet master, and then it can be put in rotation in a matter of maybe a minute or two, instead of having to go through and run a script by hand or things like this. We also used Vagrant on this project, which allows any developer to have a full local copy of those configurations. So you can have the full stack, which includes Nginx to do the rewrites back to robinhood.org if you're hitting a .NET page, which includes Varnish, which includes MySQL, which includes the connection to their mail server. So that's also been very useful in that you can test any changes against the environment on your local machine. Whether you have a Mac laptop, a Windows laptop, a Linux laptop, you can just get a virtual machine that has all the configuration and that applies it through Puppet. So that, if you needed to test something new, like if you needed to add a new rule, you can test that out, make sure it's going to work before you even have to push it to any of their servers. Now, Robinhood was already hosted at Rackspace as well. That physical hardware, some of which had been around kind of since the beginning of their old CMS, was there. And Rackspace, we've had really good luck working with Rackspace on some of these builds where people have legacy hardware. So, some of the things that Rackspace provides that makes it easy for a site to work well, one of the first ones that I have up here is Rack Connect. And so what Rack Connect does is, if you have some sort of physical hardware already at Rackspace, you can set up Rack Connect. And what Rack Connect will let you do is securely connect your new cloud VMs for your Linux stuff with the existing physical hardware that you've got. So with Rack Connect, we could very easily say, well, any of the webheads, which are cloud virtual machines, can talk back to the old .NET system, can actually proxy back to them. And it automates the firewall configurations on the hardware firewalls on the dedicated side and on the VMs on the Linux side. So basically, you don't have to worry about firewall rules. You can just say, the internet can access this box on port 80, any of these cloud VMs that are proxies can talk to the old machine, and it just takes care of automating all of that. So you don't have to worry about updating firewall rules. That's not even in Puppet. That's just handled by Rack Connect. And that's a very fast interconnect, too. And that was very important because we wanted to make sure that even if you were getting one of these pages that would be proxied through the new system, you wanted it to be very quick. And so it is an internal network connection between them. That's that interconnect that we're talking about. Rackspace also, much like other cloud providers, has cloud load balancers as a service. So just like Amazon has elastic load balancers, Linode has node balancers. They've got cloud load balancers. So you can basically just spin up, and for generally $10 a month, unless you get a lot of connections at the same time, you've got a load balancer pointing to whatever things you want on whatever port you want. They also, in the Rackspace Cloud, have been making some really interesting changes lately. So for example, in the next-gen cloud servers, they offer SSD block storage. So you can actually attach a volume to one of your VMs that is backed by SSDs, so it's very, very fast. For the commerce side, we are using a lot of encryption. So having SSD as the backing store for some of that helps a lot when you're actually doing block level or row level encryption. It really helps to have fast I/O to do that. And then at the end of the day, Rackspace has been a huge backer of the OpenStack project, which basically means that if you have some sort of library that can talk to OpenStack, which is an open source project for running a data center, you can interact with the Rackspace Cloud. So when we were working on the 12-12-12 concert, we actually just used the OpenStack compute gem to literally say, spin up 4 servers in this data center, 4 servers in this data center, and we were up and ready to go. And then finally, one of the other really nice things about Rackspace is that there's a lot of hosting companies, and certainly the hosting market has become very much a commoditized industry. But they do have a really great level of managed server support. They'll officially support the LAMP stack and Nginx and a couple other packages. And they say they have fanatical support. It's $100 per account. And so, in the case like this, if you are going to go with something like that, for the 12-12-12 concert, Robinhood did pay for that, and I'd say they certainly got more than $100 worth of value out of that, just in terms of having someone up and, taking a look at the site as it was going. So we mentioned that Robinhood had spiky traffic, and this is an example of an uninteresting month for Robinhood. So on average, on a day, you got about 1,200, I forget if it's page views or uniques that we're showing.
Visits.
Okay, yeah. So about 1,200 visits in a day. That's really nothing special, and you see it ebbs and flows as the week goes, and you're kind of okay. That wouldn't take a lot of hardware necessarily to handle. But what happens if you get a huge spike? So there are 2 different things that came into play when we were talking about how to scale Robinhood. The first was there was definitely going to be SSL in the mix, which means that we couldn't just use Varnish. We had to have something that could terminate SSL and be able to do that proxying. And then, of course, Varnish is a great reverse proxy cache. So the 2 pieces of software that we use before you get back to the Drupal LAMP stack are Varnish, which is an awesome open source reverse proxy cache, and then Nginx, which is a web server, also a very good reverse proxy. It can terminate SSL, very, very low resource usage. So those are the things that actually run. The Robinhood infrastructure has proxies up front, and then webheads and database servers. And for a while, those proxies could also call over to the existing .NET side. So as I mentioned, one of the other important things that we had to be able to do was to terminate SSL. So in other words, back when the split was still in place, if you hit https://www.robinhood.org, the browser would have to make the SSL handshake with something. And because Varnish can't speak SSL, or there's also the possibility that something would end up going over to the legacy environment, we just put the SSL certificates on Nginx itself. So Nginx can accept a set of certificates, like for start@robinhood.org, and can then make the handshake with the browser, and could then send it back either to Drupal or over to .NET. Now, of course, now that we're live with Commerce, there is no early termination. If you do hit it, it actually goes directly back to Apache, so you're not actually sending that info any further than you have to. But yeah, so the way that things worked on the site, well, we still had the split in place, where some of the content was in .NET and some of it was on Drupal, looked like this, where a request comes in, it hits the cloud load balancer, and the cloud load balancer is going to send it back to the proxies. And everything that's on this side is Rackspace Cloud VMs, Everything on this side is their existing physical infrastructure. And so if you hit something, then you see it goes into the proxies, and we were more or less able to narrow it down to just a couple of URL patterns. Like if it's a .aspx, ASHX, if it's for /media/CSS or /JavaScript, we know, okay, that needs to come from the old system. So Nginx would just do a proxy pass, go get it, serve it back out to the user. And if not, all other requests would go back to the Drupal webheads, and then there's a database layer behind that as well. And so for SSL traffic, you'll notice that actually blue denotes a non-SSL request, and red denotes an SSL request there. So we would actually still talk to the Robinhood site, the .NET site at least, over SSL. And then for SSL traffic, well, we still had the split up and going. SSL requests would come in, go to the cloud load balancers. Same thing happened. You know, they would handshake with Nginx. The same rules were in place to say if it's one of these, go over to the side. If not, go back to Drupal itself. So that way, you know, the proxies got to handle all of that. And you know, we could have probably put these all together. We could have just probably had a couple of webheads that had these all on there. But one of the really nice things about using a separate proxy tier with something like this is that it did help us to enable that Drupal and .NET split, and mainly because Varnish and Nginx themselves don't use a lot of CPU, so we could actually get away with using pretty small boxes for these. But by having separate machines, it lets us scale up the SSL termination separately. So if we would find that a ton of our work is actually being done just in talking SSL to people, we could spin up a new machine. Now, by using Nginx's SSL session cache, we actually found that it's really tough to saturate Nginx with SSL termination. Like in the past, I know people have said SSL is very, very expensive, but in all our load tests, we sooner ran out of bandwidth than ran out of CPU for doing SSL termination. So Nginx is actually very efficient in this case. And one last thing is that Nginx is good at delivering to slow clients too. Like if there's someone out there who's making a lot of requests, it's best to have Apache talk to Nginx, send it the response, then Nginx can send it back out to them. So a couple other things. One little wrinkle, the existing legacy CMS used /admin, and so did Drupal. So we kind of had that problem. Like if a request comes in for robinhood.org/admin, what are you going to do? But of course, this is Drupal. There's a module for that. There's literally a module called rename admin paths. So we could just add a prefix to all of Drupal's admin paths, problem solved. So for the 12-12-12 concert, I do want to talk about this. For a while, it was hosted in Robinhood's infrastructure, and then for a while, it had a separate one. So before you saw 1,200 visits a day, in the month leading up to the concert, this doesn't even include the concert itself, we saw an average of 100 times at its highest peak of a daily traffic increase. So we had a couple of events here. I think this was the first announcement of the concert, and then I think tickets were available at one of these others. So we had some 120,000 visit days, and those went up pretty quickly. So Molly mentioned too that we were actually serving the 12-12-12 concert site until we actually made a separate infrastructure for it. We just served it off of robinhood.org, right? It was just another one of those WYSIWYG pain stacks. Well, what happened was about 6 o'clock at night, Heather calls us up and says, one of the big stakeholders really needs this to be live at 12-12-12concert.org, like yesterday. And we're like, well, okay, well, response to robinhood.org, what are we going to do? Well, luckily, you know, we have the proxy in place. So it was easy enough to just say, if a request comes in for 12-12-12concert.org, Nginx will rewrite that to a request for robinhood.org/12-12-12, and I will go back and hit Varnish. So basically, you know, because we had this proxy layer up front, we could make a new site that responded to 12-12-12concert.org, but was really just that page off the Robinhood site. So that's another great thing about having that separate layer up front. And just to give you another idea of how spiky the traffic ends up looking, now this doesn't include the 12-12 concert traffic on the night of, but this is the yearly traffic for Robinhood. So you can see that their traffic is very, very spiky year considered. And this doesn't even include the night of. This is just for the stuff that's hosted on robinhood.org. This does not include the 12-12 concert site itself. And then I don't think we have enough time to really get into it, but for the 12-12 concert site, we set up a totally different infrastructure where we used Akamai and Akamai's global GTM, Global Traffic Manager. And then we had one data center in Dallas and one data center in Chicago. And the way that we made it work was there were a lot of things that were live updating on the site. And really all of those were little JSON files that we put like a 30-second TTL on. So basically, Akamai could check back every 30 seconds. If there was no change, Varnish would just say 304, nothing to see here. If there were changes, it would serve them back out to Akamai. So even though we did end up doing about 8 figures of uniques in traffic that night, our load was 0. Like our CPU usage was basically 0 because, you know, we could update those files and then Akamai would come back and say, have you changed in the last 30 seconds? And we'd either say, yes, here's the new stuff. And that would happen 20, 30, 40 times and not 10 million times. So yeah, most of the actual infrastructure for hosting the concert site itself was really just smart use of Akamai so that we could still have quote unquote live data, but really just letting Varnish take care of that and talking to Akamai and saying, yes, I've changed, or no, I haven't, and then tens of millions of people around the world just talking to Akamai, basically making it Akamai's problem.
Thanks, everyone. We have some links to some blog posts about this, and we can probably take a couple questions. Sure.
I guess first, are you guys going to have your slides posted? Maybe it's on there already. Are you going to have the slides somewhere?
Sure.
We're recording them right here.
Yeah,
so
they're going to be on the CapitalCamp website.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we also did a version of this presentation at DrupalCon, and so that's actually on the DrupalCon website, and so you could check that out as well. But yeah, we'll definitely be posting it on CapitalCamp.
Okay, sorry. This just came to me as my technical question was, we actually have done something very similar to this internal with Buckle, and one of the problems we're running into is as they build hundreds and thousands of blocks, it gets harder to find the pieces of content that you want. Did you guys do anything special for making it easier to find that, or have they not hit that kind of scale yet?
They really haven't hit that threshold yet. I mean, the way that they consider blocks, they still only have, I think 50 pages at the most on their regular site, not counting the commerce piece. So it's not really unmanageable yet. But I would say, though, let's say you do have millions or hundreds of thousands of blocks. They're entities, so I think maybe like a Solar sort of back-end search just for admins or something like that to make things a little bit easier to find, because Solar has some nice like spell checking sort of close search results, stuff like that. Yeah. So
on a simpler level,
right.
In the same way that the Bean module adds sort of an admin UI and makes all blocks entities, you can then use things like views bulk operations to create views that would give you sort of poor man's search, like filtering and limiting and a limited search ability to narrow down that admin experience to help you get through some of that.
I haven't encountered embeddables before. We were just using like repeatable block reference fields throughout custom layouts, so that formatter for the block reference is where the pain hits.
Embeddables too is beta as well, and it does a lot of different stuff. Like I said, it embeds nodes and all sorts of other entities, but we only used it for blocks, and the embeddable part of the blocks seemed pretty good. So take that for what it is.
Yeah. Do you have a question there?
If panels wasn't there in the shape that it needed to be, but as it's developing with Drupal 8, if you had to do something like that, would you still develop a custom approach, or would you try to hook on to what looks like Drupal 8 might?
So that's a great question. If you couldn't hear, the question was with the developments coming in Drupal 8 with the Whiskey initiative, as it's called, which sort of brings a lot of panels-like functionality into Drupal core, would we still go with something like template field or template API to help with layout? And I think that the answer is I'm not sure yet. Some of the things that panels has addressed in Drupal 7 and will sort of be covered in Drupal 8 are not exactly the same use case as what template API does here. Panels is still very much based around building the entire layout of a page, and with the way that these are very sort of more compact panes that go into a larger page, the flexibility is not quite the same. Also, the panelizer type interface is one step removed from actually doing content stuff, unless you're using the in-place editor, which is getting there, but is still not quite there in all use cases. Something we didn't mention here is that initially we were building this site with a very high requirement for workflow and revisioning. Panelizer is still struggling a little bit with revisioning and workflow compatibility. So treating everything as a node entity in the way that template API works makes it work out of the box with any revisioning system. And so I'm not sure what the answer would be for Drupal 8 yet. I think it's going to be a combination. And what's going to be great about Whiskey is it's not going to dictate that you must do it in a particular way. There'll still be room for you to add in things like template API and sort of create the right experience. Any other questions? Great. Well, I think that's all the time that we have. We'll be around if you've got more questions. Thanks a lot for coming by.